So if anyone wants to ask a question, please raise your hand and just say your name and which organization you're from. You're also welcome to ask questions in Chinese, although the answers today will be in English. Would anyone like to start with a question?
Actually, thanks. That's a great presentation. The report is absolutely brilliant. Well done. There's a lot of work going into that. I can see that. The situation is actually much worse than you portray. I can assure you there's 23 agencies involved in the street, not just the 4 main ones that you mentioned. And the reason I know that is I've been implementing streetscapes schemes for the last 20-odd years. And right outside you have one of those schemes. We've been trying recently to help the Kaduris to get 6 plant pots outside this building. We started that 3 years ago, coordinating with all the government departments. So whilst you're quite right that all these things need to be addressed, there's all the aspects related to the physical implementation of hardscape within the street that helps walkability and pedestrian circulation. So there's a lot there to do. So your issues need to be addressed, but also the means of physically implementing improvements within the street also need to be addressed very clearly. Also the paraphernalia within the street signs, talk about official street signs, etc., which you've raised in your report, all need to be controlled as well and simplified. We've done some physical surveys recently. We figured out in Lockhart Road, for example, only 60% of the pavement is actually usable by pedestrians. Okay. So anyway, just some observations, and thanks again for a great presentation and a great report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We actually had to make a conscious decision to not look at the physical infrastructure because then the report would run to 200 pages. Yeah, but yes, I take your point very well that actually improving the physical streetscape is also very challenging.
Yeah, I think that's probably like a second phase to the current report, because the current report only deals with pedestrianization.
Yeah.
Sort of the current, if you like, the pedestrian activities that are hindrances to pedestrianization. And at the start of this whole process, we ran into some, because to be totally honest, Kareem was sort of like, well, we need to add this, we need to add this, we need to add this. And I went, no. Because there's a lot more laws involved that we really don't want to go digging into. So yeah, I'd see it as a second phase. We tried to limit the scope of the research for this one, just on pedestrian activities that are going on pedestrianized streets that specifically hamper pedestrian walkways or thoroughfares. But yeah, I do take the point. As to the displays for promotions, I think that's becoming worse in Hong Kong because of the complete lack of management. I think it's now gotten to a point where it's fairly abusive. And one of the things I would say about that is the fact that it's very unfair to pedestrians who are trying to use these spaces. One of the things I find amazing, for example, if you walk out of the Causeway Bay MTR, there's always going to be obstacles for getting in and out of that exit, which there has to be some level of safety concern too. In addition to the fact that they're always very clever, they're just right outside the MTR stations, because obviously the MTRC has control of its, if you're physically within the station, then it can control what you can do, and it can fine you. Sorry.
Yes, we actually found a company that exists for the specific purpose of illegally setting up pull-up banners and then taking them away before the FEHD finds them. That is its entire business model. They have their storage boxes for these pull-up banners left out openly on the street with a sign that says, display of pull-up banners on it, please call this number. And this is not controlled at all. I have photos of it in the report. You can find them.
Yeah, there is a photo in the report.
And I think that also illustrates the fact that they're leaving their contact details behind actually indicates probably the level of fine isn't sufficient, because they've probably taken it into account in terms of their business model that they're prepared to be fined $1,500 or
Well, usually the fine falls on the person who is either promoting with the banner or who's responsible for physically setting it up. Often the company that paid for it escapes any kind of punishment. They sometimes offer to throw in like, okay, we'll pay for your first 2 fines, but afterwards you have to pay all your own.
Yeah.
When they hire these guys as basically subcontractors or independent freelancers, and they say, well, we can't control what they do. That's not our fault if they decide to stand on the public pavement.
And one of the things we did say in the report was that there should be a name and shame policy for this kind of advertising.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Alan and then Louis.
Alan Kiradia from the University of Hong Kong. I'm interested in the kind of almost like the philosophy of the law in a way, in relationship to making differentiation according to place in a way. So this is something you mentioned, and how this could be construed as a kind of like unfairness. This is allowed over there, this is not allowed over here, which means that the law will have to kind of understand place character and be able to distinguish in a way this character of this place is different than the character of that place, and for this reason, the law is different or the regulation is different.
Me not being a legislator, I can't really get into the exact details of how this would work, but in the process of my research, I was looking at policies in places like London. And what they do in London is they have this overall piece of legislation covering the whole city that says, say, they call it control of street trading, which includes things like hawking and shopfront extensions and outdoor dining. And they say, okay, we're going to control these 3 activities, and as a local authorities within London, we are going to give individual boroughs the power to decide what specific rules you want in your particular borough. So basically the legislation built in this sort of ability to devolve decision-making to a lower level of government, and they can say, okay, our borough is like this, we would like to have this thing in here and not that other thing. So if you look at the different boroughs, they all actually have different rules. Some of them actually encourage a cafe culture. Some of them say, well, this is a very busy commercial district and it's very crowded, so we decide not to allow these certain things. And so there's a sort of a devolution of decision-making power, which doesn't really exist in Hong Kong. I'm not sure whether this can be implemented, but I think you can basically think about how it's going to work when you make the law in the first place.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, there is no overarching vision for the laws, unfortunately. It's a very blunt instrument, and it's a very general instrument. And they have, I don't think there's been a lot of care taken to consider that different locations or different districts would have different needs, and therefore that they need to have specific laws for those purposes. One of the things that we have done in the report is we've actually gone through district by district and looked at the different problems that actually exist in the different districts, just to highlight the fact that actually different districts have different needs. And it may be time for the government to consider a more diversified approach to regulating all of these activities. But at the moment, it's a very blunt instrument, and it's just one size fits all.
Okay, thank you very much. I think one of our key recommendations was local solutions, and that is kind of what you're talking about. Louis?
Hi, thanks for that. I did have the privilege of doing a short preview of the report, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's a really important piece of research that's going to be the foundation, hopefully, of real action on the ground. In the UK, there was a piece of work very similar to this one that really went into all the legislation about 10 years ago, and that's been a very important piece basis of a lot of work done subsequently, but only one of the many pieces. So there needs to be, and I believe there is momentum to be doing a lot of parallel pieces of work that together with this one piece will form real action to make, Hong Kong's public spaces really fit for purpose. And coming from a kind of user-focused perspective, how is my experience of being on the street and using the street? So based on that, I wonder if you have thought of what's next? In terms of research, what might you do, or what piece of research might you do to follow up on this one, do you think?
It's a bit early. Well, upcoming, we're doing a piece of research on the quality of public open space, meaning mostly parks, so not the street in particular. But we would like to continue walkability research in several directions. And I think one possible direction might be to look at the transport manual that determines a lot of how the streets are designed, and sort of the standardization of sort of things like how wide your pavement is or how sharp the corners are, and all these, how much time you get in the traffic light to cross. All of these things are in a manual that is actually about 30 years old and probably needs to be updated. So one of the ideas rattling around my brain, but which has no firm plan yet, is to actually look at and review that.
That's also, it's a difficult one because, like we mentioned before, at the beginning of this process, we sort of sat down and I said to Corinne, how many activities are we looking at the moment? So she came up with a list, and I think the list started out at like 60 or like 40 or 60 different activities, and I went, seriously? And then, so we had to break them down to the 6 categories, and then after that we sort of looked at the law. It's still on a fairly broad basis, even within the report, but the difficulty was because we had to cover so many different activities that probably, once we'd identified the legislation or the law, we probably didn't go into that same kind of, that was our original process of brainstorming. And so, I mean, as an extension to the existing report, so as an extension to the report, I think we could probably build on the laws that are already in there and take a very detailed look at them, which obviously we didn't want to do as the first report because it would be intimidating for people to read. I mean, it's just difficult. It's difficult even now to go through, I think. So one of the things that I really drove Corinne insane on was the fact that I was like, we need diagrams. And she goes, okay, what do you have in mind? I was like, I don't know, think of something. So I sent her these terrible little Excel tables, and I went, here, do something with this. So
and then he sent them back, just make them more diagrammy.
Yeah, that was my comment. They need to be a little bit more diagrammy. So yeah, all of that hard work is Corinne's. And hopefully those diagrams are useful for people just to have a very sort of clear idea very quickly on the laws. And then hopefully from there we can do something a little bit more in depth.
Thank you very much. There are indeed many diagrams. You can find them online. The next question from Robert Gibson.
Right, I'm linked with Civic Exchange and also at University of Science and Technology. Congratulations, excellent. Very interested to hear more about your thoughts on district councils, the idea of devolving decision-making to them, of getting them in a position where they start to compete with each other as to who does the best job on street management in their area. The possibility that to do this, you need to have engagements, this sort of session with district councils in Cantonese with the Chinese language version of the report. Any thoughts on that?
Well, we're happy to discuss with them. I did interview a whole bunch of district councilors, and we have sent them a report, and there is an executive summary in Chinese, but I mean, yeah, we're willing to talk to them one-on-one. In terms of engagement between district councils and community, I think a lot of the issue is that basically district councilors only hear from their constituents when they're complaining. People call up to complain, but they never say, you know, actually we like this thing. This thing makes us happy. They never hear that kind of thing. And so they end up with a very sort of risk-averse type of politically protective motivation to basically avoid complaint. And I think one thing perhaps the government should think about, not just in district councils, but also more generally in how the departments conduct public engagement, is how to structure these engagement exercises so that they hear more different kinds of feedback, and how to engage with constituents more productively to solve problems as opposed to just receive complaints.
Yeah, I think when we started this process, I think we had a conversation about the historical, like the district officers, and how power had actually been taken away from district officers. I believe under
District councils.
District councils.
They abolished the urban
Right.
and regional municipal councils,
Yeah.
and those actually back then, they had direct executive control over a lot of these sorts of municipal services and recreational facilities and functions. Now, basically, it's been taken away and centralized up in the FEHD and the LCSD, and now there's less local control.
And so you need to look at the mechanisms by which you can now localize all of these efforts, whether, obviously, you probably can't reinstate the municipal and district councils, but I would think there needs to be, in order for effective stakeholder engagement, there probably does need to be a mechanism by which all of this executive power needs to be devolved from where it's centralized now with LCSD and FEHD.
So our next question is from Ada.
Not exactly a question, but I think I'm probably the only person in the room who was an urban councillor. And we came very close to enacting legislation for commercial promotion before the urban council was disbanded in the year 2000. So we were just that bit short. We recognized the problems then, but nothing has been done in the past 15 years, I think for various reasons. I think the most important is that we need a champion. And I don't think the champion should come from government, but the champion should come from civil society. The champion should come from a think tank. In the past, the urban councillors, they were champions. So we recognized the shopfront extension problems. We did have campaigns. We recognized a lot of the outdated legislation as far as hawkers are concerned. Hawker licenses being, they could actually have a successor to hawker licenses, for example. And for the Food and Health Bureau, they always tell us that, they have other more urgent matters to take care of. So we had SARS, and then we had bird flu, and we had all these viruses. And hawker policy, street management is something that is really not on their agenda. So I would think that we have 18 district councils. We still have a few champions in those councils. And I think it is actually very, very important to have a bottom-up movement and effort to change some of these very anachronistic laws.
Yeah, and I think just to follow up on that, I think one of the things that may be a hindrance to regulating a lot of these gaps that we've actually found, they tend to be thought of as very minor crimes, so very low-end scale of criminality. And for that reason, I don't think anybody looks at them with any kind of urgency. The problem is, I think we're now reaching a point where we're getting close to a critical mass where probably the mobility of pedestrians is definitely being affected, but also at some point you have to consider that probably their safety is also being affected. And at what point does that finally reach that critical mass where they decide we've got to actually regulate for all of these so-called minor crimes?
This goes back to the silos issue. Pedestrianization policy is under the jurisdiction of the transport department, but since they're transport, they only think about transport. They do not have the authority to think about street management, as in the software of the human activities on the street, which are split between so many different departments, all of which consider it like their lowest of the low priorities, that nobody really thinks about it. What Ada said actually resonated because I talked to someone from the FEHD union, and she said that actually even within their department, she feels like street level enforcement people don't really get taken seriously Their management levels are mostly trained in and have a background in food safety. They're not very experienced in street level enforcement. They don't really think about it too hard, and they don't really devote a lot of attention to improving the enforcement processes that are already in place for laws that exist. So basically, we have a lot of outdated and kind of awkward laws, but even the ones that exist are not really being optimized right now because it's such a low priority.
So our next question is from Jackie.
Hi, I'm Jackie. So I'm also linked to Civic Exchange. But so thanks for the report. I think it's a great report. I totally agree that we need to uplift the regulations. But I'm also having questions about how to balance, regulating the activities versus the creativity. Because at the end of the day, a lot of time when we see the government start to regulate things, and it's working against creativity. When they sort of regulate the hawkers' activities, they say, I'll give you a place which is nobody would go, that you can continue your hawking activities, or they give you a food truck zone that, again, nobody's to go, and then the whole food truck program sort of, die down, obviously. And also, when we talk about licensing and certifying who can perform street art, like who can actually do the job here, because at the end of the day, some of the international street performers, when they come to Hong Kong, when they do sort of ad hoc kind of performance, I think the whole licensing program will also sort of hindering that kind of activities. And also like separately sort of something like street art, blocking the street, like how sort of instead of overly managing these activities, and not getting all this creativity out of town, because I think when we talk about vibrant street, I think this is a critical element to this. It's not just about a good walking environment on the street, but also some of the activities that make the street interesting. I mean, and even some of the commercial activity that we talk about. I mean, obviously I hate those telecom promotion, but then some of the creative commercial activities actually making the street vibrant. Some of these ad hoc dancing kind of things actually makes the city and the street look good. So how do we balance the regulations and the creativity among these areas?
Yeah, that's a very important point, and our goal is not to overregulate everything. We don't want to turn Hong Kong into a bland shopping mall. That is not our aim here at all. And I do agree that in cases where the government has tried to foster certain activities, they are basically so timid about it that they end up, basically undermining their own scheme, and it ends up not working. I think part of this is sort of addressing the public engagement side and engaging with the community more productively to come up with solutions, and not always just listening to those who complain the loudest, because often it's a very small group of people who complain a lot, and then they end up swaying the entire decision-making process, even if it's just one person who complains. And I think basically the government needs to build sort of engagement mechanisms that insulate themselves from these kinds of, pressures. Secondly, I think we can look to overseas examples for a lot of rules and methods that they have used to both regulate and encourage things like street performance or artists and other things like that. There are cities where they say they might have like different rules for different areas, whereas some areas are like, okay, there are actually no rules here, you can perform wherever you want. Certain areas are more sensitive, there's residents here, you need to apply here. So basically there needs to be more sensitive sort of management and sort of more location-sensitive management. I think the waterfront is a great place to have all of these activities, especially when the central waterfront is complete in the future. You're not bothering anyone out there, and it's going to be a popular destination. So I think you should actually encourage more of these activities out there.
Yeah, I think that you could encourage all of these activities if you had a decentralized system. And what I mean by that is you may have different districts where there's different levels of tolerance for these kinds of creative activities. And so for those districts that actually have a greater tolerance for artistic activities, they should be allowed to actually say, well, listen, in our area, we would like to have these things, and perhaps we don't need them to register. They're free to do as they want within these spaces that we've designated or set aside for them. And in other places where perhaps there's a higher concentration of residential buildings and so on, that maybe they would have exercise greater control over those activities. But I think at the end of the day, it's difficult if you have a very centralized policy-making process on this, because all of the needs of the different areas of Hong Kong and all the different districts, as you see from the report and all of the case studies for each of the districts, that they're actually quite like there's very different problems faced by each of the pedestrianized areas in the different districts.
So in the back of the report, there are actually case studies from Taipei, from Singapore. So we did also, the researchers did actually look outside of Hong Kong for some examples.
And there's various boxes interspersed throughout with like short examples from the different cities.
So we have time for one more question, which I guess will go to this gentleman.
Thank you. Peter Dampier from Bureau Happel Engineering. I'd echo what other people have said, that it's been a very thorough report, looking at the constraints, etc. But I suppose, the question was about what's next. Has any thought been given to a more data-driven approach with regard to sort of crowd and people flow modelling? An example, we've actually worked with New York City Council looking at Broadway and sort of, I suppose, developing a tourist route that actually took away the local community from the tourist areas. I'm not advocating that as the idea, but actually you said it's getting to crisis point. So actually some data-driven analytics would actually aid that case and give you that championship to move forward. So just throwing that out there, really.
I would tend to agree. I think particularly where you've got a high concentration of obstacles, particularly, for example, for commercial promotion and so on, or in the case of Mongkok, where they've got the amplifiers set up and then they've now taken to just roping off and taking traffic cones to the streets, and you don't actually have the authority to do that. So I think that the data analytics that came from that would be very useful in driving home the point that actually these types of unregulated activities are now occupying a disproportionate amount of space in the streets and in pedestrianized areas, and it's incredibly unfair, and also having a negative impact on the environment.
Well, I think in terms of future research directions, I think I would like to see more of this sort of data-driven stuff, but you're going to have to talk to my boss.
Well, on that note, we will end the Q&A session.